In the early 1990s, Ernie Reyes Jr. looked like the future of martial arts cinema. At a time when Hollywood was still searching for the next generation of action stars, he had everything studios claimed to want: elite martial arts training from childhood, explosive athleticism, acrobatic control, natural screen presence, and a look that fit perfectly into youth-driven action films. He was not a late bloomer or an overnight experiment. He had been preparing for this path since he was a child, raised inside a martial arts culture that treated discipline and performance as inseparable. By the time most actors were attending auditions, Reyes was already executing complex fight choreography with professional precision, and Hollywood noticed. His early exposure to film came quickly. He appeared in The Last Dragon in the mid-1980s, a cult success that proved audiences were hungry for martial arts stories infused with personality and style. Even though his role was small, it placed him in a space most young performers never reached. Hollywood followed up with Red Sonja, a far bigger studio production meant to position him closer to mainstream action cinema. That film failed financially and critically, but it did not end his momentum. At that stage, Reyes was still viewed as raw potential rather than a finished product. The industry still believed he could grow into something larger. That belief quietly materialized in one of the most influential action franchises of the era. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles did not sell Ernie Reyes Jr. as a star in name, but it sold him in motion. Inside the Donatello suit, he became a core physical performer of the film, responsible for the agility, balance, and expressive movement that helped make the Turtles feel alive. Most audiences had no idea who was inside the costume, but the industry did. What mattered was that he delivered. When the sequel arrived, the studio gave him a visible role as Kano, allowing him to step fully on screen and interact directly with the leads. For a generation of kids, Reyes suddenly became recognizable, cool, and credible. He was athletic without being stiff, charismatic without being loud, and believable in fight scenes without relying on editing tricks. By 1993, he was everywhere. His image was closely associated with youth action culture, and his name carried weight among fans of martial arts cinema. This was the moment where Hollywood usually transitions a rising performer into a long-term lead. For most action stars, this phase determines whether they become franchise material or remain supporting players. Reyes was given that test with Surf Ninjas. It was his first true leading role, designed to showcase him as the face of a movie rather than part of an ensemble or hidden behind a costume. Surf Ninjas arrived with expectations but failed to meet them. The film struggled tonally, leaning heavily into comedy while trying to function as an action vehicle. It underperformed financially, failing to recoup its budget. In Hollywood terms, this mattered more than talent, effort, or audience goodwill. The industry often treats a first lead role as a referendum on marketability. When that single opportunity does not translate into box office success, studios move on quickly. Reyes had finally reached the moment everyone claimed he needed, but the result closed doors instead of opening them. After Surf Ninjas, the shift was immediate. Leading roles disappeared. The momentum he had built throughout the early 1990s stalled almost overnight. He continued working, but the scale and visibility of his projects dropped sharply. Television roles replaced film leads. Appearances became smaller, more fragmented, and less influential. By the time Rush Hour 2 was released in 2001, Reyes appeared only briefly, a blink and you miss it moment in a massive blockbuster. It was not a comeback. It was proof of how far his position had fallen within the industry hierarchy. This was not a case of lost ability or lack of professionalism. Reyes was still physically capable and creatively sharp. That became clear in the rundown, where his fight sequence stood out as one of the film's most memorable action moments. The performance demonstrated speed, power, and authenticity that many contemporary action actors lacked. Yet even that did not lead to a resurgence in leading roles. The industry had already moved on. One lead failure was enough. The system rarely allows a second climb, especially for actors who do not fit Hollywood's narrow idea of what an action star should be at a given moment. By the early 2000s, Reyes faced a hard reality. Martial arts films were no longer dominating the box office the way they once had. Studios favored different archetypes, and the window that once existed for performers like him had closed. Instead of disappearing entirely, he made a strategic pivot. He moved into stunt work, a path that allowed him to stay close to action filmmaking while accepting that Hollywood no longer viewed him as a bankable lead. Unlike stars who transitioned from stunts to acting, Reyes did the reverse. It was a survival move, not a failure. That decision kept him working, but it also placed him in a part of the industry where visibility is minimal and financial security is uncertain. Stunt performers are essential, but rarely celebrated. As Reyes continued down this path, the cost of that invisibility would eventually become impossible to ignore. By moving into stunt work, Ernie Reyes Jr. stayed employed, but he also stepped into one of the least protected corners of the film industry. Stunt performers carry enormous physical risk while receiving none of the long-term security that leading actors enjoy. And there are no massive residuals, no guaranteed insurance safety nets, and very little public recognition. For Reyes, this transition was not a creative downgrade. It was a practical response to an industry that had quietly decided his time as a lead was over. He continued to contribute to action cinema in physically demanding roles, absorbing impacts, executing choreography, and helping sell danger on screen, even as his name faded further from public awareness. Throughout the 2000s, he remained active, appearing in projects that required elite martial arts skill and precision movement. His work ethic never declined, but the industry's perception of him had changed permanently. He was no longer framed as a star in development. He was viewed as a utility player, someone reliable, disciplined, and expendable. This shift is critical to understanding why his career never rebounded. Hollywood rarely reverses its classifications. Once an actor is placed into a supporting or behind-the-scenes category, climbing back into lead territory becomes nearly impossible, regardless of talent. Then, in the mid-2010s, Reyes' life took a dramatic and unexpected turn that had nothing to do with casting or box office performance. He was diagnosed with end-stage kidney failure. His health deteriorated rapidly, forcing him into dialysis and placing his survival in question. For someone whose livelihood depended on physical capability, the diagnosis was devastating. Long shooting days, intense physical exertion, and unpredictable schedules became incompatible with his condition. The illness exposed another harsh reality of the stunt world. Consistent work does not guarantee financial stability. Medical bills mounted, and Reyes found himself in a position that shocked many of his longtime fans. In 2014, a public fundraising campaign was launched to help cover the cost of his medical treatment. The target amount was modest by Hollywood standards, but the fact that it was necessary at all revealed how vulnerable performers like Reyes truly are. Despite decades of work in film and television, he did not have the kind of financial cushion people assume comes with a recognizable career. The situation underscored how little protection exists for those who spend their careers absorbing physical punishment for entertainment. A year later, his sister donated a kidney, saving his life. The transplant marked a turning point, not just medically, but psychologically. Recovery was long and physically taxing, and Reyes had to relearn how to manage energy, strength, and endurance. Even after the operation, chronic fatigue remained a factor, limiting the type of work he could realistically accept. This was not a temporary setback. It was a permanent recalibration of what his career could be. For many performers, such a moment would signal the end. For Reyes, it became a moment of clarity. Hollywood had already shown him that it would not reopen doors simply because he survived. The industry's silence after his recovery was not accidental. By then, he had aged out of youth-driven action roles, and the system had no interest in reframing his narrative. The second rise never came, not because he lacked ability, but because the structure of the industry does not reward persistence unless it aligns with commercial timing. Instead of waiting for permission that would never arrive, Reyes chose a different path. He turned inward and began building his own creative space. This decision led to the development of the Ninjaverse, a project he created with his family, including his children. Rather than chasing studio validation, he focused on ownership, control, and sustainability. He wrote, produced, directed, and starred, reclaiming agency over his work for the first time in decades. The project was not designed to compete with blockbuster franchises. It was designed to exist on his terms. This shift reframed his entire career. Success was no longer measured by box office rankings or studio approval. It was measured by longevity, creative independence, and personal fulfillment. While Hollywood never allowed him to reclaim the trajectory he seemed destined for in the early 1990s, Reyes found a way to remain relevant without compromising his health or dignity. He became an example of how talent can survive outside the traditional system, even when that system refuses to reconsider its initial judgment. The phrase, "they never let him rise again," is not a dramatic exaggeration. It reflects an industry pattern that rewards early success and punishes even minor commercial missteps with permanent demotion. Reyes' story is not about scandal, ego, or decline in ability. It is about timing, categorization, and an unforgiving system that rarely grants second chances. He did everything the industry asked of him, delivered when given opportunities, and still found himself sidelined once the numbers failed to align. What makes his story compelling is not the absence of success, but the endurance beneath it. He remained disciplined, avoided controversy, and continued working through physical pain and personal crisis. While his name may never carry the weight it once promised, his career reveals something more honest about Hollywood. Talent alone is not enough. Survival often requires adaptation, humility, and the willingness to build something when no one else is willing to offer it. By the time Ernie Reyes Jr. entered the later phase of his career, the contrast between perception and reality had become impossible to ignore. To audiences who grew up in the 1990s, he was still remembered as a martial arts prodigy, a symbol of a specific era when physical skill mattered more than camera tricks. To Hollywood, however, he was no longer an investment. The industry had already categorized him, and once that classification was made, there was no incentive to revisit it. This is the quiet truth behind why his career never climbed back to the level it once promised. Hollywood does not operate on fairness or nostalgia. It operates on momentum, timing, and risk avoidance. Unlike many former child or teen stars, Reyes did not self-destruct. There were no scandals, no public meltdowns, no reputation issues that could explain his disappearance from leading roles. He stayed disciplined, professional, and focused on his craft. Ironically, that made his story less visible. The industry is quick to explain a fall when chaos is involved. It is far less interested when the cause is structural and impersonal. Reyes became one of many performers whose careers stalled not because they failed creatively, but because the system moved on and never looked back. Another factor that limited his return was the changing shape of action cinema itself. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Hollywood's idea of an action star had shifted. Studios favored either hyper-muscular spectacle or grounded dramatic realism. The middle space, once occupied by agile martial artists, began to disappear from mainstream films. Action choreography became more fragmented, editing became faster, and physical authenticity mattered less than brand recognition. Reyes' strengths, which once made him stand out, no longer fit the dominant model. There was also a deeper issue that the industry rarely acknowledges openly. Opportunities for Asian and Asian American actors in leading action roles have historically been limited and fragile. Reyes' early success placed him in a rare position, but it also meant he carried an unfair burden. When Surf Ninjas failed, the setback was treated not as a single project missing the mark, but as proof that he could not carry a film. Other actors in similar situations were often allowed multiple attempts. Reyes was not. That imbalance played a quiet but significant role in how quickly his momentum disappeared. When he transitioned into stunt work, Reyes demonstrated another side of his professionalism. He did not treat it as a consolation prize. He approached it with the same discipline that defined his acting career. He trained, adapted, and continued contributing to the industry in a way that kept production safe and believable. Yet stunt work, by design, is invisible. The audience applauds the result, but rarely asks who absorbed the impact. This invisibility compounded the erasure of his earlier stardom. The health crisis he faced in the 2010s further complicated any chance of a traditional comeback. Kidney failure was not just a medical emergency, it was a career-ending threat in an industry that demands long hours, physical endurance, and constant availability. Even after his successful transplant, the reality of chronic fatigue and physical limitation reshaped what kind of work he could accept. Hollywood does not build schedules around recovery, it replaces people quietly and moves forward. What stands out most is how Reyes responded to all of this. He did not chase sympathy or attempt to rebrand himself through controversy. He did not position himself as a victim of the system, even though the evidence supports that interpretation. Instead, he shifted his focus toward ownership. The creation of the Ninjaverse was not an attempt to relive past glory. It was an assertion of independence. By producing his own work alongside his children, Reyes reclaimed control over his narrative and his labor. This move highlights a crucial truth about longevity in entertainment. A second rise does not always come in the form people expect. For Reyes, it did not mean returning to studio-backed leads or headlining blockbusters. It meant building something sustainable that respected his health, his experience, and his values. While Hollywood never reopened the doors it closed in the 1990s, he stopped waiting for permission. The phrase, "they never let Ernie Reyes Jr. rise again," ultimately reflects more than one individual career. It reflects an industry that treats opportunity as disposable and talent as replaceable. Reyes was given one clear chance to prove himself as a lead, and when that moment failed to align with box office expectations, the verdict was final. There was no reassessment, no long-term development, and no safety net when his circumstances changed. Yet his story does not end in bitterness or obscurity. It ends in resilience. He survived an unforgiving system, a life-threatening illness, and decades of professional sidelining without losing his identity or discipline. His career may not resemble the trajectory once predicted for him, but it stands as a case study in endurance. In an industry obsessed with comebacks, Ernie Reyes Jr.'s story is quieter and more honest. It is not about reclaiming a throne. It is about continuing to stand when the world decided you were finished.